Paul from Stone Meadow Photography, and today I'd like to do a quick video on how to quickly edit a photo that has blown sections and dark sections simply because of the high dynamic range of the photo. And so I'm going to use a photo from a friend of mine who's asked me to edit the photo, and I'm going to show you how we use Adobe RAW to improve the photo. So I'm going to take the photo here and I'm going to drop it straight into Photoshop. And as you can see, we've got a picture here of the Colosseum. And one of the issues here is that we've got lots of blown out section over here, and the sky is practically the same color as the Colosseum as well. There seems to be a reasonable amount of detail here in the shadow sections, but clearly because of such a high dynamic range, we either have real blacks over here or real whites over here. So fortunately, my friend's taken this photo in a RAW format, so there's a lot of detail there that we can hopefully recover. So over here we're going to have a play around with a number of sliders, and the sliders we're going to particularly deal with are exposure, highlights and shadows, and whites and blacks, and then clarity and vibrance. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the exposure so that you can see this little peak here, it's peaking. So I'm going to reduce the exposure a little bit. Not so much that I start to get all blacks over here, but I'm just going to reduce it until I can reduce the actual peaking that's happening over there. Now the photo has become a little bit darker, but that's okay. We're going to recover as lots of details as possible. Now we're going to reduce the highlights. So what we do is we're going to reduce those highlighted areas even more without actually affecting the shadows in this region. So all of a sudden we start to see detail back into the Colosseum, and we start to get some color back into the sky. The next slider I will move is the shadows, and what that is, it brings back all the details here in the shadow region, and I would suggest push it in all the way up to the top. So now all of a sudden, if you look at the histogram and look at the picture and the before and after, just playing with those slides have made a huge difference in terms of bringing back information. I then move the sliders that are the whites and blacks, and what that does is it ensures that we get a whole range of darks and lights in our image without picking. So what we literally are doing is stretching this histogram out a bit. So I'm going to move the whites across until I see that little peak of arrow and so forth. By the way, if you hold down the Option key while you slide that as well, what you can do is when you see the white starting period, you can start seeing it on the screen. So that's probably a good setting like so. And same with the blacks. I'd move the blacks down, and if I hold the Option key down, I can start to see which part of the images are truly black. Now it's okay to have a little bit of black because clearly things in deep shadow is okay. So ultimately you choose a value that is best. What you again want is a good range, but having a little bit of black and a tiny bit of white is okay, as long as it's not a major part of the image. The next thing I'm going to look at is temperature. Now this temperature looks a little bit cool, a little bit blue to me, and its temperature is at 4,850 Kelvin, which is actually quite cool. And that's predominantly because of the shadows here. It's most likely an automatic setting on the camera. So I'm going to shift this to daylight, and you'll notice automatically it's become a little warmer, a little bit more yellowish, and it's much more natural. I would argue maybe cloudy, maybe even a little bit better, or shadow, maybe even a little bit better. And you'll notice that the temperature's now jumped way up to 7,500. The stones have become richer and warmer, as you would expect if they were hitting the sun. The shadows here are also in a nice tone as well. Now I would play around with that until you get a value that you particularly like, but I think that is a particularly good value over here. The next thing is we're going to touch the clarity, which just brings a little bit details in there. You don't want to shift that too much. Becomes a bit forced. And finally, we also want to look at the vibrance. Now the vibrance is a more natural way of boosting color. I avoid using the saturation because it becomes a little bit unnatural, whereas vibrance generally warms up more the yellows and the greens as opposed to the blues. So with just those few sliders, you can see here by pushing this button, we can see the before and after. We've brought a huge amount of information back into the image. Another thing that's a little bothering me is the photo is taken a little bit on an angle. So what we're going to do is we're going to straighten up the photo. So if I press this is a straighten tool. When I press this over here, this allows me to straighten the image. And the way we do that is we drag a line that what we think is a straight line. Now I think this photo is a little bit on the leaning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag a line, what I think is supposed to be horizontal in the photo. Now, if I do it incorrectly, there's not a lot of information here that suggests it's horizontal. You can see I now have this checkbox, and I can then move this mouse over here. And again, I'll just have to check it again. I'll do this, okay, like so. You can see I can now go and drag my image out like so, which allows me to crop as well. But what we're really interested in is straightening it. And so when we do that, we can play around with what we think is going to be straight. And again, I think it's leaning, so I'm going to turn it a little bit one this way. And then if you press return, you find it's straightened up. Now, again, I think it's needs a little bit more straightening. So again, if we press that button over here, we can then again rotate it if we wanted to do a little bit more. And so again, what you can do is find something that you think is straight, and there's not a lot, but fortunately we do have a vertical straight, so we can actually use that aspect there because it also works on the vertical. So if we do that and try that, there we go, that's much better. So it seems a little bit straighter. Again, the before and the after, it's now straight, but of course we use the vertical line here to help us determine what is straight. I could do a few other little things. For example, the sky looks a little bit on the greenish side. So what I can do is I do a little of a gradient, and this button over here allows me to do a gradient filter. So I'll press that button. Now, in this case, I want to choose what is my predominant thing that I want to choose the gradient on. And at the moment, if I press the minus sign, it resets everything and makes the temperature being the main thing. Now, if I pull that down, you can see I get a nice gradient over there. I'm not happy with that color specifically, but what we can do is we play around with that, and you can see it becomes a little bit bluer. Now, I see a little bit of greenishness in there, so I can actually move that opposite to get a little bit of a magenta back in there. But again, you can see you're going to have to play around with it in order to get the right details that you want. Again, I can reduce saturation a little bit like so. I can then reduce the exposure a little bit like so. And again, if I leave that on there and press this button, it'll only show you the comparisons of the before and after for the gradient. So there's the before and there's the after. As you can see, that sky is much nicer now. The only problem is that gradient bleeds a little bit into this section. So while you've got that on, if you press, if you highlight it like so, and then press brush over here, you've got this minus sign, you can now paint out the section of that mask. So it only affects the actual sky. So I'm just going to brush that back out like so, over there. And if I put this on, I can see where I've brushed it out or on, and I can tweak it over here. By the way, there's a little bit of an overlap here, but that's not going to be very obvious once I've finished the editing. And again, this just shows me what the mask looks like, and then I have that. And again, that's before and that's after, and now the sky is a little bit blue and not as green, and I'm pretty happy with that. Again, if I want to get out of that, I then may just use this symbol over here. I'm now actually back in my main area. Let's have a look at a couple of extra tabs here too. I could play around with curves, though I'm pretty happy with the tonality in that case. Over here, I've got sharpening, and my view is bump up the sharpening, but you want to make sure that the sharpening applies only to the edges. And again, the way you do that is using this masking tool. Masking tool basically forces the sharpening only to occur in areas where there's detail and not in areas where there's not a detail. So you don't want the sharpening effect on the sky, you want the sharpening effect on the actual edges. So how can you tell what you're sharpening? So again, what you do is you hold the masking button down, and you hold the option button in. And if you slide across, you can start to see everywhere that's white is where the sharpening is applied. And I'm going to move it right across to about this position over here. And now what I'm doing is I'm only applying sharpening to those areas that I've shown before. Now, this is not particularly visible, but if I do it before and afterwards, there is a slight variation in that it's become a little sharper. There's a few other settings you can play with. We're not interested in at the moment. I would always recommend doing lens corrections. What that does is remove any issues in terms of color diffraction that occurs at certain lenses. So I always put that on. I always put the camera profiles on if necessary. If it's a recognized lens, it'll correct it. And that's pretty much it. You could add a little bit of post-crop vignette. I always like a little bit of vignette. There's a number of ways to do it. You can do it in Photoshop or you can do it here. And if I move it across, you can see the vignette coming in and out. And I usually like a little bit dark in a vignette, just a little, only because what it does, and I enjoy just the feathersness, because it forces you to look here in the center. As I think through it, I sort of play around a little bit more with maybe the levels. I'm thinking this could be a little bit lighter, so I can actually just boost the shadows up here and the darks over here. Not a lot. And I bring the highlights and so forth down just a little. Again, you've got to be playing around with it so it doesn't look too flat. You want to actually get a good range over here from dark to light. I think I'm pretty happy with that image. I might adjust the color a little bit here and so forth. Once I'm happy with the image, let's have a look at the before and afterwards. You can see that is a huge difference. All I now need to do is open image, and I could either open an image, or if I hold down the I can open a copy, or I can save the image. But let's say now if I press open image, this now will open up that very photo in Photoshop. So let's just arrange my workspace so we can actually see. There we are, put everything in the front screen there. I've got the photo done. I'm not going to do anything else to it. So the last thing I need to do is I need to save it. And initially, of course, I can save it as a TIFF file or whatever I want. I just choose this case a Photoshop file, which is a PSD file, which I can save. If I then want to, and now it's saved. If I then want to save this as a JPEG, I go to save as, and now I'll pull this menu down to JPEG over here. In this case, I'm going to save as whatever it is. I would always choose a quality of 9 or high, but it all depends on what you plan to use it for. Let's just leave it at this setting at the moment. And that is now saved. And if I take that away on my desktop, I should have 2 copies of the photo. There it is. There's the JPEG version, and there's the Photoshop version, and there's the original. And you can see just from the icons here that they're vastly different. Well, I hope that has helped you in understanding how to quickly edit a RAW photo. Thanks for listening.